most leaders, when they hear, you got to make people feel like they belong, they go straight to, well, I'm not really that warm and fuzzy kind of person. That's not my strength. But really, almost none of what Walton and Cohen are describing is about warmth. It's about paying attention, noticing who didn't talk in the meeting and going back for their thoughts. Remembering that the new person wouldn't have context of what we're discussing, and so giving it to them as opposed to waiting for them to ask for it. Build on somebody's idea out loud so the room registers that the idea came from that person.
Welcome to You Might Try This, a podcast about learning how to lead without losing yourself along the way. Hosted by executive coaches Stacey Philpott and Cade Cowan. This show draws on 25 years of experience working with high-level leaders and brings those lessons down to earth. If you're navigating leadership for the first time, managing people, questioning old rules, and trying to build a career that actually feels good, you're in the right place. This is You Might Try This, honest leadership advice for ambitious people who still want to sleep at night.
Welcome back to You Might Try This, the show for leaders who are figuring it out in real time. I'm Stacey. Cade's here, same as always.
Hi, everybody.
Last week, we had Pascal Finette on, and the thing he kept coming back to was that leaders who stay relevant over the course of their career aren't the ones who already know the most, but they are the ones who learn the fastest. And I've been thinking about that ever since our conversation because it tees up some things that I've been wanting us to get to, Cade.
Oh, I know. I know you've been anxious for this.
I am. And I am because up to this point, Cade, we've really been talking about leaders as individuals. How do you give feedback? How do you have hard conversations, think clearly under pressure, or just generally keep your head above water when things are going a mile a minute at work? Mm-hmm. I think it's time that we started talking about things in the other direction. And I'm hoping that the next handful of shows are going to be all about the people around leaders, right? Your boss, your peers, your team, and how do you actually read them and lead them? So today is a little bit of a hinge, and we're going to go in that direction. And I want to start the conversation by talking about what I think is the most basic element that serves as the foundation for every team. And that is whether people on the team actually feel like they're on it.
All right. So I think that's a fantastic pivot for us to take for these next few episodes. And speaking of that idea of do people feel as if they're even on the team, you can see this play out so many times, which is someone really good will get hired. They're talented. Everybody's glad to have them there. And then about 10 or 11 months in, they're gone, or they've quietly checked out, which is kind of the slower version of eventually being gone. And you sit down with those people who leave a team early and you ask them why. And the answer is almost never the work itself, and it typically isn't the money because they wouldn't have joined if the money had not been right in the first place. But what comes out over and over is some kind of version of, I never really felt like I was part of it. Yes, I was in the meetings, I saw my name on the org chart, but I was sort of just standing on the outside of things. Nobody was unkind. I didn't have a big fight with anybody. It's just, I never got pulled all the way in. And, by the time that it shows up in a resignation, you as the leader, you've walked past like 100 small moments when you could have done something about that.
That is so true. And that, I think, raises the reframe that I'd like us to think about, which is most of us treat belonging as a feeling. Whether do I feel like I belong? And it's either something that happens on a team because there's chemistry or it's like the weather. And we assume that maybe some leaders are particularly good at creating a sense of belonging because they're more warm or likable or outgoing. And if, you're not one of those people or that's not your personality, too bad, right? But that's not actually how it works. Belonging isn't a mood that settles over a group on its own. It's something that leaders do to nurture, to build, to create. And it gets built on purpose via a lot of very small, specific, sometimes almost boring ways. And it has more to do with the choices that are made about what you were alluding to, about who gets kind of pulled in and how. So the good news about that is it is something you can do, right? It is a skill and it's something you can get better at, whether you're the warmest person in the building or not.
Yep. And I want to put a little bit of research under this, a bit of new research, and then some that anyone who's listened to us would have heard us mention before because it keeps coming up. I think it's so powerful. But let me start with what some people might not have heard because we've not discussed this before. Back in 95, there were 1995.
It didn't seem that long ago until you said it like that, did it? I know. 1995.
So in 1995, two psychologists, Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary, they pulled together studies to answer this pretty basic question, which is how deep does the human need to belong actually run? Is it a nice to have, the thing you get to once the real needs are covered, or is it something more fundamental than that? And what they argued after going through what had been decades of research from others is that the need to belong, to feel like you're part of a group, that there are people who'd notice if you were gone. Like that's one of the most basic drives that we have. It's not a luxury that you earn after the important stuff. It's like closer to the need for food or the need for safety than to a simple preference. Like we're wired to, want in. And then that second piece of research. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Stacey.
Well, I was just going to say, as a mom, watching kids navigate it, that desire for belonging can be so obvious, but we see it at work. People act like that need to belong is something for kids or people who haven't, quote, developed, and we can develop out of it. But as you were describing that, kid, I was thinking we see it, we're human beings, and that belonging stays with us, right, throughout our career. So anyway, I was just thinking about that. So go ahead. You were talking about the second piece, right? So on top of that it's this need, but what else?
Yeah. So the second piece, again, we're going back to Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA when she did these fMRI studies looking at what parts of the brain were activated, particularly during times of social exclusion. So if you're being iced out or you're left off the invite, somebody talks past you in the room, the same circuitry in the brain lights up as it does during physical pain. So, the brain processes being left out a lot like it processes getting hurt. So, when somebody on your team feels like they're on the outside of it, it seems to bother them more than perhaps you'd expect. That isn't them being needy or oversensitive. It's just that brain circuitry doing exactly what it was built to do. I always remember that, we talk about FOMO, fear of missing out. It's a real thing. There's pain associated with it. So when you put the two things together, here's where it leaves you as a leader. Every team you run has a center and it has edges. There are people who are clearly in. They got looped into the side conversation or their ideas got built on. Somebody asked them how their weekend was. The boss remembers their kids' names. And then there's almost always somebody out toward the edge, and maybe this is the newest person. Maybe it's the quietest person. Maybe it's the person who's a little different from the rest. Maybe it's the oldest person, the youngest person, the gay person, like all of the persons. They're kind of sitting on the edge, and the thing about the edge is that the person standing there, they usually know they're there. And the people in the center don't usually notice that they're in the center.
That's right.
Kind of perhaps assuming you could kind of call, so you got this edge of the room, and the leader's real work and the part that never makes it into the job description is knowing who's standing on the edge and figuring out how to pull them in.
Well, there are a couple of things I'm thinking of as you said that. One is when you're in the center, you don't realize it. It just feels normal. But when you're outside, it does not feel good. And all of us have had that experience at some point. Some of us more frequently than others, but we've had it and it doesn't feel good. And then there's something interesting in that analogy, Cade, that I'm thinking of is there's also that experience of being right on the boundary. So you're not really in and you're not really out, but you're kind of going back and forth. And that can be a particularly difficult position to be as well. What I would say is from the coaching side, the edge of the group rarely looks dramatic. It's not like you're on the playground in elementary school anymore and you're not allowed to go on the the jungle gym. Oh God, I sound so old. I don't even know what to call them anymore. You're not allowed to go in the play structure that's been safely approved.
That you still sound old. Say it like that.
All right. So it doesn't feel like that, right? But people picture being on the out of the group as being exclusion, as somebody being actively shut out. And once in a while, it is that, but mostly it's kind of those run of the mill, not quite being in. The person who slowly stops being asked because they're harder to read. The remote person who's in the meeting, but it's not really included fully in the meeting or in the conversation. You know, as we were thinking about this topic, I remember a leader I worked with, they had joined a company as a vice president. And this particular person was leading a function. So they were a member of the executive committee. And they were commuting because they weren't ready to move their family, and they were commuting every week. And this leader was planning to move to headquarters, but hadn't quite done it yet and was trying to get situated. So would go down on Sunday night, spend the whole week down there in an apartment. And after a while, she began shortening her trips. So from being there 5 days to 4 days to 3 days, because when she was there, it didn't seem to make much of a difference. There weren't people to eat lunch with unless she reached out. She rarely met anyone outside of work, even though in the evening she reached out to set up dinners with her team or other people. And after a while, it felt like too much work. And paradoxically, the more she went down to headquarters, the more she felt like she was on the edges. And it became painful, and it wasn't dramatic. It just gradually built over time because it was a series of moments where she wasn't really pulled in. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great example of how sometimes it feels or gets created.
Yeah, you know, another place that you'll sometimes see this, Stacey, is where there's like a dominant function at the, say, senior table. Imagine that you were sitting at the leadership table of a large law firm. You could imagine that most people on that team are going to have legal degrees. They will be lawyers. But let's imagine the person who is HR or finance, who doesn't share that legal background. You'll sometimes see subtle exclusions there. I've seen it also in companies where there's a real strong engineering background. Again, you've got the engineers who then become the in group, if you will, and the edge tends to be those people without that same engineering background. Not to pick on engineers, but again, it's where there's this functionally dominant group of people on, in the center.
Well, we can pick on lawyers for a little while. I think what you're making a good point, which is there's a lot out there around identity and groups, right? So we think about women and men and older people, younger people, white people, people of color, gender identity. There are a lot of things that create that sense of being in the center or being on the edge or being on the outskirts. In organizational life, there are also memberships according to a whole host of things. What function are we a part of? Which location are we working from? How long have we been in the company? Who are we associated with? I mean, how many times have you been in a meeting where people start the meeting by saying, tell me your title, which indicates function, and how many years have you been here?
I was on a call yesterday where the woman said, oh, I've been here. I've been at the company for 3 years. I'm still a newbie.
Yes.
Or, ooh.
You're like thinking,
how old do y'all live there?
Right. And so what have we learned in that moment? In that moment, we've learned that tenure is important in this culture, and it has a sense of belonging. The longer you've been here, the more in the center, the shorter the time, the closer to the edges you're going to be.
And in some companies, Stacey, you and I have observed that tenure is a proxy for how wealthy are we based on, is it?
That's right. It's code.
It's code, particularly if it's a company that's done well, if it's grown really rapidly in the last 20 years, that person who's been there for 20 years, who saw the growth do like this, it's code for, wow, a lot of money, a lot of power.
Yes. Yes, it is. So there are a lot of things that indicate whether we are in the center and when we're on the edges. But I think the most important thing is what you said. When you're in the center, you don't know it. And when you're on the edge, you do. And I think we're going to come back to that. I want to bring up some other research that I really like that you introduced me to, because it talks about what are the things we can actually do to create belonging, right? We can diagnose it and think about it, but how do we actually create it? And it's based on the work of two psychologists, Greg Walton and Jeff Cohen. And their research focused on the concept that we now call belonging uncertainty, which is the quiet question some people carry into a room that others don't have to, which is, do I belong here? Am I one mistake away from it being obvious that I don't? It's a very precarious feeling when you're on the edge. What they observed, not surprisingly, is what we're just talking about now, which is the people who are more likely to be carrying that question of, do I belong, usually are the ones who are different in some way from the majority of people in the room. And it's often more visible. So, for example, they looked at research around students or members of groups who had less power and were more likely to interpret those groups. The people in those groups were more likely to interpret normal social setbacks, such as bad grades or feeling left out, as evidence that they didn't belong based on their identity. The way I like to think about this is, when you're not part of the majority or the power structure, you often get a little paranoid. You don't know if things are happening to you because of you or because of part of your identity. So the classic study, I was just talking about that and curious about your thoughts, Cade. The classic study they did was with college freshmen. And they gave half the participants survey results that showed that most first-year college students, regardless of their race or gender, worry about whether they belong in college. And that most students, however, feel at home in like a year or two. So they normalized it. They said, look, how people feel, it's typical to feel like you don't belong, and eventually it goes away. They were given the message that that doubt you feel about whether you belong is normal, it's temporary, and everybody feels it at first. The other group was given information about how classmates, political attitudes changed over time. What was interesting about the research that they found was that the African-American students who received the intervention, that belonging, feeling that you don't belong is normal and temporary, had higher GPAs and better achievement records 3 years after that intervention than the students who just heard about the political attitudes changing. So when someone was told, your feeling isn't a part of your identity, it's normal and it's typical and it's temporary, it gave them confidence that actually led to better performance. They even did a second study, I think 10 years later, that tracked the same participants and found that the effects persisted, which is pretty strong. So I love that study because it shows how normalizing, helping people feel connected, not worried about their sense of belonging, knowing that we all feel it, getting joined in our humanity, can make a huge difference.
I mean, think how many people we know that work on, new leader assimilations, new leader orientations, like put that kind of info in those orientations, right? Now and then, as you're new, you might feel on the outside. It's temporary. It goes away. Might be helpful.
Yeah. One of the things, it's funny, I hadn't realized, linked it back to this research when I'm working with executive teams. One of the first things I do is I talk about what are the scripts that are usually running for people in a team, which is what's going on in their head that they're not saying. And one of those questions usually is, how much am I going to have to sacrifice my own success for this team's success? But the other question is, how included in this group am I? It's a basic question. Now, there's some similarity here to the concept of psychological safety that I know we've talked about before, but it's not quite the same. Cade, you may have some thoughts about this too, but what I think about is that safety is whether is it okay to speak up, to disagree, to admit a mistake without getting punished. But belonging is underneath that. It's, am I one of you? You could have safety, but still not really feel like you belong. And likewise, you could belong, but not necessarily feel that the group that you belong to, it's okay in that group to bring up mistakes. So that's just my thing. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
No, well, again, it comes back to the role of the leader, doesn't it? So whether it's psychological safety or creating a sense of belonging, the leader is the most important person in determining whether or not that stuff's there, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And it's the small stuff, isn't it? It's the small stuff that leaders do. That's what I love about this research.
And what's useful about the small stuff is it takes the whole thing off the personality question. Most leaders, when they hear, you got to make people feel like they belong, they go straight to, well, I'm not really that warm and fuzzy kind of person. That's not my strength. But really, almost none of what Walton and Cohen are describing is about warmth. It's about paying attention, noticing who didn't talk in the meeting and going back for their thoughts, remembering that the new person wouldn't have context of what we're discussing. And so giving it to them as opposed to waiting for them to ask for it. Build on somebody's idea out loud so the room registers that the idea came from that person.
Yes.
I've watched pretty gruff leaders, people that you'd never, ever, never call warm.
Really? Never call them warm?
Be pretty good at this because they were simply paying attention. And then, on the flip side, there are warm leaders, likable leaders who are actually kind of terrible at it because while they're warm, the warmth was pointed at the people in the center. So it turns out to be less about how warm you are and more about who you're keeping track of, and that's something almost anybody can get better at on purpose, whether you feel like you're a warm person or not.
Yeah, I was thinking, I have a colleague who, whenever we're meeting a new group for the first time, he does this thing that reminds me of like church. He would always go around and make sure he met every single person in the room and said hello, and he calls it hellos. And I was like, what? I was like, oh, he's the warm. And I used to say, oh, he's the warm one. And it's not me. I know you're shocked, Cade, that someone would be warmer than me. And he once mentioned to me, he said, it's about making sure everybody is seen when we start the meeting and everyone knows that they have a right to be here. So I think that's a great example. Anyway, well, Cade, what are some practical things? I feel like we, I love that when we talk about that. What do you think?
Yeah, so let's get practical because, in all of our shows, we try to hand folks something that they can actually do this week, not just something to believe. And here it all comes down to one move, really. And that's you've got to be able to see the edge of the room before you can do anything about it. So the first one I'd give you is just kind of do an edge scan. Like it's pretty small, but in your next team meeting before you walk in, think about the question, who's at the edge here? Not in any heavy way, just, who's not talked or who's the newest, who's a little outside the main current of this group. And then sometime in that meeting, figure out how to bring that person in by name, on something real. And don't do this where you say, hey, Stacey, you've been quiet. Anything to add?
Oh, please put me on the spot. Could you make me more uncomfortable?
That just shows that you're kind of sitting over there on the edge. But it'd be more like, hey, Stacey, you've worked on this thing in the recent past. How did you handle it? You're not making a thing of it. You're just like taking one moment of the meeting and you're routing it through this person who otherwise might have spent the whole meeting sitting on the edge. You're pulling them in,
Mm-hmm.
So that's one, an edge scan.
I love that. I love that.
And then the second one, if I may, is kind of close behind it. And it's like building on. So this one's for that moment when somebody at the edge floats an idea, and usually it's half formed. It's okay. Sometimes it's said a little bit quietly. Sometimes it's said with, well, I was just thinking, there's like hedging. So the move for you then is to like go back and build on that out loud where you say, hey, wait, say more about that. And then once they've said more about it, all right, so if we did that, it also fixed the thing we got stuck on Tuesday, like build on it. Don't leave them hanging out there because, again, they're going to leave feeling that they're on the edge. You as the boss, as the manager, you've got the most power in the room. You build on their idea in one way or another. You've just legitimized their idea and therefore them. So those are a couple for me.
I love both of those. And I think it is really powerful. I have been in so many meetings where people are just piling ideas into the center of the table and don't do enough to build on someone else's idea. And it's so powerful. I love the way you're mentioning that.
Well, and one thing I would add is we know about this, I think I've heard it called the anchoring bias.
Mm-hmm.
Typically when a leader says, what ideas do you have? The most extroverted person or an extroverted person is going to give the first idea. And we tend to anchor on the first idea, whether it was a great idea or not. And you read that research and you're like, well, of course we do. I've experienced that countless times. So that's another reason to build on ideas coming from the edge.
Yes, and go back. Don't just stay focused on that. Love that. There's a third one that I can give, which is going beyond what we've talked about already in terms of validating and normalizing things for people. And that is about what you do, right? Mm-hmm. Which is what can you do outside of the meeting? Okay, there's behavior in the meeting, but outside the meeting. So let's say maybe this week you're going to pick one person who's drifted a little bit to the edge. And instead of a single gesture, you're going to give them a way back in. So you put them on a project that actually matters. You start bringing them with you to other meetings or places that they weren't going, and you make it recurring. Because a one-time invitation tells somebody that they were remembered, but a standing invitation tells them that they're part of how this works now. The greatest thing a leader can do to someone who's on the edge is to give them a method or a vehicle or something standing that pulls them in towards the center.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Just as you say, this standing invitation. It can work so well. And, one way that I've seen this work is where, and it's never this dramatic case, but it's like the steady veteran on the team that everybody's kind of quietly filed as, they're biding their time or they're done growing. You hand them something real and recurring. And a lot of the time that person that you'd written off is kind of checked out, turns out they were just waiting for somebody to ask. So I've seen that before. And it's so affirming actually to see somebody. Everyone wants to contribute. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about this standing invitation is it allows for that contributing, which makes people feel valuable.
It really does. It really does. And it points to the responsibility of those of us who, when we are in the center, and if we think about it as sometimes we're in the center and sometimes on the edge, we have a bit of a responsibility to pull other people in.
Yeah. And you know what, Stacey, this episode convicts me a little bit in all honesty, because I just think about the pace at which we all run. And how we're attempting to get from one meeting to the other, and how guilty I am of, of ignoring the edge and not doing enough to create that sense of belonging with people. So this one's a good one to be reminded of, I think.
It is. Well, and it points at where we're headed next time too, which is if belonging is built by who you pull in, the thing that quietly decides who you leave at the edge is the assumptions that you're already carrying about people before they've ever done anything. And some of those are automatic. And the most automatic of all is the one we make in about half a second, which is about my favorite, how old somebody is. And that's where we're going to go next week. So we'll be talking about 1995 all over again. So anyway.
I wish I could say I was from 1995. All right. Thank you, Stacey. So you got the homework, folks. Just take a look at your next meeting and see if you can find the edge of the room. Once you can see it, the rest of this is going to get a lot easier. So with that, we'll see you next week. Thanks, Stacey.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to You Might Try This, brought to you by EDC and Edgewise Media. To learn more about the podcast, visit youmightTryThis.com or connect with us on social media.